Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And here's Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Well, good morning to you.
Well, Helsinki, they still haven't stopped talking about the meeting.
Well, I'm not sure they're going to stop talking about the meeting. It's difficult to know. As a historian, I'm very aware that what we sometimes think is important today doesn't seem very important a year from now or 10 years from now. And by the same token, things that we didn't think were very important turn out to be of great significance. But Helsinki seems to me to be one of those moments that really, in a sense, helps to define President Trump. Not necessarily the Trump administration, but certainly the president. And the reason I say that is because the president essentially sided with the Soviet premier, Vladimir Putin, against the observations and the investigations and so forth of 17 different American intelligence agencies. And that has never, ever happened before. And so one has to ask, why is he doing this? President Trump is essentially saying that the Russians didn't meddle in the American election in 2016. And by the way, Brian, I really find the word meddle to be misused, because it was more than just meddling. It was really an assault on the democratic process in this country. Be it as it may, of course Putin is going to deny that. And yet the president continues to agree with Putin that there was no meddling, despite the fact that there is overwhelming evidence that there was, Soviet involvement. No, I say Soviet, really not Soviet, but Russian involvement in the election. So, it raises questions about what's going on in our president's mind. Putin, the Soviet premier, has an agenda, and that agenda includes the following. Number one, it includes denying involvement in the election. Putin has done that ever since 2016, and he continues to do it to this day. Number two, it includes Russian involvement in the Crimea. The Russians have essentially absorbed the Crimea back from Ukraine into Russia. It's a violation of international law. It's a violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of many, many different standards of international activity, and that was created during the 20th century. And yet our president is not only supporting Putin in respect to his denying of involvement in the election, he's also supporting Putin in respect to the Crimea. The Russians are involved in Ukraine, fighting in the Ukraine right now, or at least supporting a civil war in the Ukraine. Our president supports the Russians in that area. Putin wants to, and one can understand this, he wants to weaken NATO. That may be his most important single objective. Our president wants to weaken NATO, in spite of the fact that our entire intelligence community, and certainly the foreign policy community generally, believes that NATO has been one of the reasons why there has not been a major war in Europe since 1945. Our president said, for instance, that, why should we defend Montenegro, a tiny country with, I think, if I'm not mistaken, only about 650,000 or 750,000 population. Well, that's in a sense what the British appeasers were saying before World War II. The point is that if you have an agreement, if you have an alliance, it's a defensive alliance, not an offensive alliance, you have an obligation to defend everyone in there. And there are other things. Putin wants, of course, to see the end of American sanctions on Russia. The president wants to see the end of American sanctions on Russia. Putin wants to weaken the European Union. Our president has called the European Union our foe. Putin wants to disrupt the Western economies. Our president is supporting what essentially will become, and is already becoming, trade wars and whatnot. So my point is not so much to give you a laundry list as it is to say that in almost every important way, President Trump is supportive of the agenda of the Russian government, of the Russian premier.
Now, conservatives during the Helsinki visit Conservatives were arguing that the intelligence community, A, put Trump on the spot by arresting all those agents when Trump was in Helsinki with Putin, and B, the conservatives say the intelligence community has pretty much been out to get Trump since he's been campaigning. What would you say to that?
I think that's hogwash. The intelligence community is not, quote, out to get Trump. I would guess that probably more, how shall I put it, FBI agents, more CIA agents are lifelong Republicans than they are lifelong Democrats. So that, it's not a partisan warfare. And I think it's also important to remember that the conservative community is split. Certainly the Republican community is split at this point. There are many Republicans, as we well know, who support Trump. Some of the more recent polls suggested that up to maybe 70% of Republicans generally support what Trump did in Helsinki. But there's also, that other 30%, and some of them are pretty articulate about this kind of thing. Senator McCain, for instance, said, and I quote here, that it was one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. George Will, who I think is an outstanding, maybe the most important writer of conservative commentary, has described the sad, embarrassing wreck of a man. That's a direct quote. Senator Flake has called Trump's performance in Helsinki shameful. Senator, or what I think will become Senator Romney, Mitt Romney, has called it shameful and disgraceful. And a Texas representative, again, a conservative Republican, said that I would never have thought that a U.S. president would become one of those who were played by these old KGB hands. In other words, it's not as if Trump is being supported by all conservatives. There are quite a number of Republicans who are kind of never Trump Republicans, and you've probably heard some of the comments from a few of these people. So I think that one is going to have to be a little bit discriminating and take the facts as they are. In other words, not allow one's political predisposition, pro or anti-Trump, to affect the way in which we view his particular performance in Helsinki.
Were you surprised that Senator Ted Cruz of Texas has turned around as much as he has? Because he started out as a never Trumper.
Well, I am surprised to a certain extent. Look, it has been said, maybe a little cynically, that a politician's most important interest is in getting reelected. And in a state like Texas, where you have a great deal of pro-Trump support, if you want to get reelected, you better support the president. We saw what happened to a congressional candidate in Alabama who had made comments a woman who had made comments very critical of Trump, and she lost the primary. So I think that, someone like Cruz may simply see the handwriting on the wall. On the other hand, he was very, very anti-Trump, needless to say, during the primaries in 2016. He wanted the nomination for himself. So I think that one has to take a little bit of this with a grain of salt.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower, can we talk Israel for a second?
Yeah, sure.
News coming out of the Times of Israel and other media outlets this morning from the Times of Israel. IDF shoots down Syrian fighter that entered Israeli airspace. 2 Patriot missiles fired at an aircraft that penetrated 2 kilometers into Israeli territory, according to the military.
Well, it's a little bit difficult to fully distinguish what's going on in northern Israel versus what's going on in southern Israel as it pertains to Israeli foreign policy. So let me just back up for a real quick second. Over the past weekend, I believe it was Friday if I'm not mistaken, maybe Thursday or Friday of this past week, there were quite a number of rockets launched by Hamas into Israel. Now this is after something of a truce, and the Israelis sent a plane, I guess, to maybe it was an observation plane. I really don't know the details here. To check out what was going on in Gaza. That plane was fired on, and in turn, the Israelis then sent additional planes into that area, so that there's kind of firing by one side, which leads to firing by the other side, and it's difficult to stop that kind of thing. Although I think it's quite clear at this point that Hamas does not want to launch another war. Be it as it may, is this related to the Syrian probe into Israel? We don't know why that Syrian fighter entered into Israeli war space. It may have been simply an error. It may have been deliberate. It may have been to check Israeli radar defenses. For whatever reason, the Israelis are not going to stand back when they consider their security at risk. So they shot the plane down. Will that lead to additional Syrian involvement? Probably not, if only because right now in Syria, once again, there is an uptick in activity in respect to the civil war in that country.
Talking live this morning with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower, who's in the studio this morning. Can I ask another Israel question if you got a sec? Okay, and I get this from the UK Daily Star. The leader over in Turkey is using some pretty rough rhetoric against Benjamin Netanyahu, saying the spirit of Hitler is alive over there in Israel. He went on to say that Israel is the most Zionist, racist, fascist country. Netanyahu hit back, saying Turkey has become a dark dictatorship under Erdogan there. And Netanyahu accused Erdogan of massacring Syrians and Kurds. Your thoughts?
Well, these leaders are trading insults, and there's nothing new about this. What is new is the degree to which Erdogan in Turkey is drifting more and more and more toward autocratic rule. Turkey had been for many, many years a democratic country, at least, reasonably so, and that is disappearing. Erdogan has jailed tens of thousands of people who he considers to be his political opponents. He has forced them out of government positions or even army positions and so forth. And so we see, the real beginnings of autocracy. I mean, look, a lot of President Trump's critics claim that he is acting similar to Erdogan, and for instance, in the way in which he has now stripped a number of intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, of their security clearances. But needless to say, I think the point here is that Erdogan is a head of a quasi-religious party in Turkey, and when you mix religion and politics, you get the kind of aggression. Maybe aggression is the wrong word, but the kind of assertiveness that you have right now in respect to Turkey vis-a-vis Israel. The Israelis and the Turks had a very, very close relationship for the last, roughly speaking, 40 to 50 years or so, and that is clearly breaking down. Now, whether this will lead to any kind of, armed conflict, is very, very hard to see. Remember, Turkey does not border Israel; they don't have a common border. But I think that Netanyahu, and I'm no Netanyahu fan, but I think that Netanyahu is correct in charging Erdogan with the slaughter of many of his opponents in Syria, and certainly many of the Kurds. Erdogan is not Mr. Nice. I think that what you have there is a deteriorating situation, and a situation in which autocratic rule is becoming much, much more common than it had before.
Iran and Trump, lots of back and forth there, too. We're going to talk about that with Dr. Gary Ostrower after the forecast.
It's the summer clearance event at Maple City Dodge. 2018 Jeep Compass Latitude 4x4, only $189 a month. $189 a month. A 2018 Dodge Journey Crossroad, all-wheel drive, only $219 a month. $219 a month. 24-month leases on both, $2,999 due at signing. Some restrictions and fees may apply. See a Dodge Boy for details. Check out the 2018 Jeep Renegade Limited 4x4 with up to $4,500 cash allowance this month only. Some restrictions apply. See a Dodge Boy for details. Hurry in to Maple City Dodge Hornell.
Checking in this morning with meteorologist Gary Best, who says
humid. That's going to be the weather word for today. It's humid all up and down the eastern part of the United States right now, Brian, and this humidity is going to continue for the next couple of days, along with a few showers. Most of the showers right now I see are off to the east and southeast of us. So we'll have some partial sun during today with a few showers and thunderstorms around. Temperatures up near 80 during this afternoon. A flash flood watch is in effect. Tonight, showers and thunderstorms. Now, tonight, some of the rain could be locally heavy. Low temperatures down around 70. And tomorrow, more clouds and sun. Pretty good chance tomorrow of showers and thunderstorms with a high near 80. But the showers tend to end Wednesday night. Thursday, partly sunny and only isolated showers by then. It'll be in the 80s on Thursday. And mostly 75 to 80 for Friday and Saturday with a mix of clouds and sun and perhaps a few widely scattered showers.
And we're talking with Alfred University professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Went to the break saying that we were going to come back and talk about Iran and Trump.
Well, let me just make a comment, if I may, about something we were talking about just before the break, which is that Erdogan had compared Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel to Hitler. If anyone wants to provoke the Israelis, just use the Hitler comparison. You can understand why any Jewish politician, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Israel, is not going to take very, very kindly to that. So I think that one has to understand that Erdogan has his own agenda, and part of it, as I say, is to try to, as best he can, more or less discredit the Israeli leadership. So far as Iran is concerned, look, I think that the Israelis believe right now that Iran is their greatest single opponent, their adversary in the Middle East, and that's not going to go away. The Iranian government under the mullahs ever since 1979 have been viciously anti-Israel. The Israelis have not been, all that, they've not always been good guys either. I think that their policy in respect to settlements in Palestinian territory and whatnot is bound to provoke a good deal of opposition, and it has provoked that opposition not only in the Middle East, but certainly in Europe, and to a certain extent, though not as much, in the United States. But what the Israelis have feared is that the Iranians, if they do develop nuclear weapons, are going to be a mortal threat to Israel. They might even be willing, given their religious views, to accept, some serious damage if there's a nuclear exchange. But by the same token, Israel is so very, very small, and it has such a very small population, that Israel would be simply obliterated in the event of a real nuclear war between those two countries. So the Israelis have been very, very vocal, I think, and very supportive, I might add, of President Trump in his anti-Iranian policy. Now, we saw just within the last 24 hours, we've heard that Trump is making more threats against the Iranians. He's saying that, they will suffer punishment like no country has ever suffered before. Well, what is he really threatening there? I mean, is there a possibility of actual armed conflict today? Is there a greater likelihood of armed conflict between the United States and Iran? And the answer is, yeah, there probably is. When you use that kind of language, you're provoking people, again, on both sides, and it leads to an escalation of tensions. But one hopes that, cooler heads are going to prevail.
We've been talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. And can we talk a little bit about Albany politics, Governor Andrew Cuomo, the governor's race?
Well, sure. I'm no expert in Albany politics, not like Dr. Robert Heinemann, who is occasionally a guest on this program, but I'll do my best.
Well, Governor Andrew Cuomo is, I would say, based on the emails that I get, all the media gets in New York State, it seems like he's running a little bit as if he's scared of Cynthia Nixon. He responds a lot in action to things that she'll make a criticism and then he'll make a policy change. But when you see the polls, and some people criticize polls saying that it's wishful thinking oftentimes on the pollsters' parts, but Cuomo is so far ahead of everybody else, it's unbelievable. Well, is it necessary for him to run in this way that he is, moving farther to the left and almost in panicky response to Cynthia Nixon?
I think that Cuomo is being very cautious. First of all, polls are sometimes wrong. They were certainly wrong in respect to the election, the presidential election in 2016. Even Donald Trump did not believe that he was going to win that election, which may help to explain some of the dumb things that he said during the campaign. But so far as Cuomo is concerned, I think that he knows this, that a Democratic congressman who is running in a re-election campaign, okay, in a primary campaign for re-election, lost just within the last month. A Democratic congressman who had been around for 20 years, who was probably going to be the most important single candidate for Speaker of the United States House of Representatives in the event that Nancy Pelosi should no longer, hold that post. And yet this fellow lost. And he lost against a candidate who stood considerably to the left of himself. No one expected that kind of result. And so I'm guessing, again, I don't know what Cuomo is really thinking, but I'm guessing that he's saying, hey, I'm not going to take any chances. If I'm a little bit overconfident, then I'm going to get myself into trouble. And by the way, we have certainly seen a resurgence of left-wing Democrats, not only in New York State, but we've seen it elsewhere. We've seen it in Virginia. We've seen it in California. So yeah, I think that Mr. Cuomo is being especially cautious at this point. The polls seem to show, at least the last ones that I had seen, that he's probably ahead in the Democratic primary by something in the neighborhood of 70% to 30% for Cynthia Nixon. But my hunch is that that's going to turn out to be a good deal closer. And I also want to remind you that when Cuomo last ran 4 years ago, he ran against a Democratic candidate by the name of Teachout.
Zephyr Teachout.
And she turned out to be a much stronger candidate than anyone had anticipated.
That could be what's at play here.
Exactly. And Cynthia Nixon has even more visibility than Teachout, than Zephyr Teachout.
And now Zephyr Teachout's running for state attorney general.
Yeah.
You know who the smartest one of the candidates is that Sean Patrick Maloney, the congressman downstate. That guy is sharp. I covered him at the Democrat straw poll convention back in 2006. That guy's quick on his feet, and does he have a mastery of facts?
Is that the fellow, again, you got to inform me here. Is he running for lieutenant governor? Is that the fellow we're talking about?
No, Sean Patrick Maloney's a congressman downstate. He's running for state attorney general.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I look, there are a number of people. We don't get as much information here about these state races that, perhaps you do if you're living in a metropolitan area like Buffalo or New York City. But I think that, look, this is going to be an interesting year. There was also, I think, some indication, which I, came across as recently as yesterday and early this morning, that generally, that nationally, the Democrats are probably going to do a little bit better than they had anticipated in the House of Representatives. We have been saying for the last, 3 or 4 months that possibly, just possibly, the Democrats might take the House of Representatives. That seems a little bit more likely today than it did a couple of weeks ago.
Dr. Ostrower, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here, Brian.
Over the